There are a lot of really, really good tested recipes out there. We talk about using research-based tested recipes. And that's important because the research has been done on those to know what process needs to be done, how long it needs to be processed. That's done for you. If you're taking a recipe out of a general cookbook or recipe that was passed down through generations or things like that, it's a guess. And you're really gambling by guessing on what kind of processing you should do with that. And that could end up being dangerous.
Canning season typically runs from June to October, with some carryover into the holiday season. Harvesting garden produce at its peak freshness and canning as soon as possible, ideally that day or the next, produces the highest quality product. However, safely preserving food for later use involves a number of steps. On today's Sound Living, preserving the freshness of homegrown food. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. Kansas State University food scientist and coordinator of the university's Rapid Response Center, Karen Blakeslee, says the first step is covering the basics, making sure you have the proper jars and lids, checking your canning equipment, and using researched and tested recipes. Karen, we're entering food preservation mode, and we really want to start with just some of the basics, and that starts with reading the instructions on whatever it is, whichever process you're going to use.
Exactly. It's always good to read through your recipes, make sure you have everything that you need, make sure that you have the proper equipment for whatever product you're wanting to can. So take some time and do that. I often get calls from people that are in the middle of the process and they'll say, oops, I did this, or oops, I forgot that. And, that's not the time to try to figure that out. So plan ahead a little bit. Take a little time and figure out what you're going to make. What do you need to do this properly?
And along those same lines, we need to make sure that the canning supplies we need are in stock and that we have them in the house.
Exactly. I know in the last couple of years that there's been some big challenges with canning supplies, mainly lids, but those are getting back in stock. At least around here, I've been seeing them on grocery store shelves, which is a very good thing. So try not to take them all. I know it's exciting to see them back on the shelf. And look at your own equipment, too. If you've been canning for years, the only thing that you need to buy every year is new lids. Everything else can be reused. Look over your canning rings that screw on top of the jars. Make sure they're not rusted out. If they're rusty or got dents in them, that can affect how that ring screws onto the jar. And it may be difficult to get it off in the end, too, if it's rusty. So swap those out with some new ones if you need to. Inspect your jars. Jars can be reused every year. Take good care of them and they'll last quite a long time. But look at the sides of the jars. Make sure you don't see any scratches because that could lead to jars breaking inside the canner, and that's always a mess. I've had it happen, I know. Take your finger and run it around the top rim of the jar where the lid sits. And make sure you don't feel any nicks or breaks or anything like that. And if you do, just use that jar for something else, like storing cotton balls or something like that. Take a good look at those. Always inspect your canners. Make sure that they're in good working order. Make sure they're clean. If you have a pressure canner, make sure the vent port is completely clean. There's nothing stuck up inside that vent port. You can use like a pipe cleaner and run that through there, and that easily cleans that out. That way you get the proper pressure on your canner. Check the seals. If you have a rubber seal on your canner lid, make sure it's not dry or cracked or anything like that, because that'll affect how the canner holds pressure. So you want to have a really good seal, and you can get replacement parts for most canners. If you have some really old canners, it's really hard to find replacement parts for them. Do a good inspection. If you have a dial gauge pressure canner and you haven't had your dial gauge checked in a while, now's the time to do that. And many extension offices can help you do that. Now, we can only test 4 brands: National, Presto, Magic Seal, and Maid of Honor. Now, I know some of you might have a brand called All American, and that also has a dial gauge on it. But we cannot test those gauges, and actually the manufacturer, they don't test them either. What they recommend you do is use the weighted gauge that's on that canner because it has both. The newer styles of those have a weighted gauge and a dial gauge, and they will tell you in their instructions to use that weighted gauge as your pressure indicator. The dial gauge is there just to show that, yes, I do have pressure in it, and you're good to go. If you have an older style of that kind of canner, that All-American brand, it will not have a weighted gauge on it. It has what they call a petcock on it, and you can get that replaced with the weighted gauge. So give them a call. It's the Wisconsin Aluminum Foundry up in Wisconsin. They're the ones that manufacture that, and they can help you out with that. I just wanted to make sure I bring that up because we often get people that bring in their All-American brand canners to get the gauge tested, and we can't test those. So want to save you a trip on that. And again, give your canners a good inspection. On your water bath canners, many of you probably have the enamel wear type canners. That's the black and blue with the white speckles on them. You know, those can last for a long time, but if they ever get chipped, they'll start to rust. So give those a good inspection, too. The rusting starts, it's not going to stop. And eventually it's going to eat a hole through it. So take good care of those. Try not to bang them around too much because that'll cause those things to chip and crack. There's other ways to do water bath canning. There's one that we used to not recommend doing steam canning, but now we've had some research done by the University of Wisconsin. They did some research using a steam canner, which is basically, it's a low-profile pan, and then it has a dome top with a temperature sensor in the top of it. I know one brand that's like that. And you can use that kind of steam canning process for water bath canned foods that process for a total of 45 minutes or less. It does have some restriction on it. The advantages of using that type of canner, it's not so much water because it's a steam system. That low-profile pan, you only put in enough water just to barely cover the rack that's inside of it. And that will generate steam while you're processing. The reason it's only 45 minutes or less is because that steam evaporates and you run out of water. And you're not supposed to open up the lid and add more water. You lose all your steam. So that's why that's a limitation on that. But it works really well for like jams and jellies, some tomato products or some fruit products like peaches, pickles. It would work really well for that. And it's not so much water to handle, so it's kind of a safety factor too. So that might be an option for some of you.
One of the things that we're really looking at here is whether something is high acid or low acid.
Yes, that is a important distinction to be aware of, and that determines which processing method you're going to use. So high acid foods are your jams and jellies, your pickles, most of your fruit products, those kinds of things. Salsa, that falls into there. Those types of products either have enough acid naturally on their own, or they've had acid added to it to make it an acidified food. And that makes it a high acid food, and those can be processed in a water bath canner. What we're looking for here is to destroy any kind of spoilage microorganisms. If you're concerned about botulism in those kinds of foods, it's really not a concern because botulism doesn't like to grow in a high-acid environment. But we do want to take care of the yeast and mold that could possibly be there. So water bath processing is important for high-acid foods. Low-acid foods are all your plain vegetables and your meats. Those must be pressure canned. There is no other option for that, for canning those. And that's because they naturally have a low acid content. And that low acid environment can support the growth of botulism. So we need to use a pressure canner to get the temperature up to make sure that we destroy those organisms. So it's an important distinction to be aware of. Now, there are some products where there are instructions you can do either way. Most tomato products can be done either way. There are some fruits that can be done either way. Just be sure to follow the correct instructions for that. And speaking of instructions, what recipe you use really does make a difference. There are a lot of really, really good tested recipes out there. We talk about using research-based tested recipes. And that's important because the research has been done on those to know what process needs to be done, how long it needs to be processed. That's done for you. If you're taking a recipe out of a general cookbook or recipe that was passed down through generations or things like that, it's a guess. And you're really gambling by guessing on what kind of processing you should do with that. And that could end up being dangerous.
And just because we're doing this food preservation method doesn't mean that this food is going to last forever. We still need to use it.
Yeah, and I like to tell people when I teach classes, I say, you're not putting these in a museum. Let's use them. You've put a lot of good work into making these products because it does take a lot of labor to do this. So use them. And we recommend using these home canned foods within 1 year. A lot of it is for the quality, but it could be the safety too. And it forces you to rotate your foods out. Same is true for anything you buy at the grocery store, too, on your canned foods. Rotate those things out and get them used up.
The idea is to be able to enjoy these foods in the colder months when we can't have them.
Exactly. I mean, it's kind of fun to have an almost fresh-tasting jar of tomatoes in the dead of winter and use that for a tasty meal.
One other thing I wanted to mention real quickly is the fact that altitude also comes into play here. You were talking about recipes, and I think people are thinking, well, Kansas is flat. Well, I don't need to worry about altitude, but you do.
You do. Absolutely do. Kansas is not as flat. It might look flat, but it does rise in elevation as you go west. It's around, on the eastern side of the state, it's around 600-700 feet or so above sea level. But when you get out to the Colorado border, you're getting around 3,000, close to 4,000 feet. So it does make a difference because that rise in elevation causes the boiling point of water to go down. And so you have to adjust your recipes and your processing times or pressure to make sure you're processing up properly. So for high acid foods that you're water bath canning, as you go up in elevation, recipes will tell you to add processing time to that. So it processes for maybe 5 to 10 minutes longer, depending on your elevation. And that's for high acid foods and water bath canning. For pressure canning, you would add pressure, and your recipes will tell you that. Make sure you read the instructions. I know there's like the Ball Blue book and the University of Georgia's So Easy to Preserve book are excellent books. Read the instructions in the introduction chapter to know there's a chart, and it'll tell you how much to adjust for your elevation. USDA-based recipes, our recipes that we have in our publications, we've got that built into the recipes so that you can see it right there, what adjustments you need to make. It's a really important thing to do.
Well, I know a lot of people have taken up gardening over the last 3-4 years, and as part of that, we're seeing people be more interested in food preservation, but we want to make sure they're doing it safely, and really, if they have any questions, they can go to your website, and you've got not only our information from Kansas State, but information from all over the country.
Yes, I do. I work with some other food preservation specialists across the states, especially in our north central region, which includes about 12 states from here up to North Dakota over to Ohio and then back down. And we really try to work together to get the proper information out. And so on my website, which is the Rapid Response Center website address is www.rrc.ksu.edu. And then you'll see right there the link to the food preservation section.
That's Kansas State University food scientist Karen Blakeslee. Again, for more canning and food preservation information, visit rrc.ksu.edu. As coordinator of the Rapid Response Center, Karen publishes a monthly newsletter filled with food safety and food-related information. You'll find a link for that publication on the webpage. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.